So without further ado then, I'll hand over to Stevie-Jade Hardy from the Youth Endowment Fund, who is chairing our first session of the day on doing diversion differently. Stevie.
Thank you very much. I actually thought that was for me standing up, and then I realised it was because Neil had finished. But thank you, I'm going to take it for me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. In my humble opinion, I think you're all looking, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. So thank you. And why wouldn't you be? Because we have a Bobby Dazzler of a session to kick things off today. Why are we laughing? We really do. So my name's Stevie, I'm the Head of Change for Policing and Youth Justice at the Youth Endowment Fund, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session on doing diversion effectively. So this is something that the Youth Endowment Fund care passionately about, and that's because our mission is to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence, and diversion can play a key role within that. So over the next 3 presentations, you're going to hear about the evidence base on diversion. You're going to hear about some reflections on implementing local diversion schemes, what worked well, what didn't work well. And you're also going to hear about some effective practice principles. So as I say, we've got quite the session ahead of us. My biggest challenge, and actually if I manage to do this, it'll probably be better than getting my PhD, is that we finish with time for questions. And so that's what I'm going to be aiming for. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Carlsen-Browne, who is the Senior Manager for Reducing Reoffending at Devon and Cornwall Police. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I knew I'd get the gig of the morning after the night before. So, but no, in all seriousness, thank you so much for the opportunity to present my research that took the form of a pre-implementation case study or pre-mortem exercise on the state of readiness of forces in England and Wales to implement the legislative requirements around out-of-court resolutions as prescribed within the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act. Long title. But before I start, and for the benefit of those that might be facing still the daunting prospect of formulating ideas for your thesis, do listen to the advice you get at Cambridge to make it manageable and targeted, because mine was none of those things. In other words, I went big. Acquiring data across 43 forces, collation of large amounts of data sets that all had to be coded, whilst attempting to make sense of an implementation process that was still in motion. So it's important to note that the research captured a specific moment in time from June to October 2023. However, I would like to think that it's still an important piece of research, and it's particularly relevant when faced with significant financial constraints and when the prison population is nearly at capacity. I think it's an appropriate time to be asking, is there another way of doing business? Over the last decade or so, there has been an unprecedented level of activity on diversion. This table summarises it, and it's so detailed you won't be able to read it. So it's a great illustration of the amount of activity that's happened over the last 10 years. The context of the current changes can be traced back to an announcement by Chris Grayling, the then Justice Secretary, to end what he regarded as the caution culture, back in 2014, at a time when actually the use of out-of-court resolutions had halved from its peak in 2007. So in response to a government review and consultation that proposed a reduction of out-of-court resolutions, a 3-force pilot was undertaken to evaluate the use of a reduced framework of community resolution and conditional cautions. The testing of this new approach set the course for the commitment from the MPCC that forces would voluntarily move to a reduced framework. From 2017 to 2020, you get a kind of rekindling of interest in the evidence around diversion, particularly deferred prosecution as a potentially effective response to disproportionality of treatment and outcomes from those from ethnic minorities, as encapsulated in the Lamy Review. Between 2018 to now, there's been a flurry of activity, often stuttering, led by the Ministry of Justice and coordinated by the MPCC. But by August 2001, only 17 forces had adopted the two-tier framework. However, the subsequent reconstitution of cautions into two new disposals, both with conditions, the community and the diversionary caution, and is yet still to be implemented, largely blindsided forced diversion leads. And it is within this period, with a cycle of false starts, that this research was conducted. Just a little tag there to immediate justice, short-lived, I was going to say experiment, but short-lived kind of programme of immediate kind of community payback, ceased in funding as of August this year. So, before I get into the detail, let's talk about the methodology and approach. The data used was primary data, collated from semi-structured interviews, and a focus group conducted with individual key stakeholders and forced diversion leads, and then an all-encompassing survey of the 43 forces. The process of coding data was adopted from grounded theory method to form a narrative description of the main theoretical themes that accurately depicted both the state of readiness and identified what lessons could be learnt for future implementation. You know, the researcher, that's obviously me, I am an insider with responsibility for diversion in my own force. This status was beneficial, though, because it obviously provided professional knowledge. It was enabled me to ask sort of insightful questions and interpret the research. But obviously this needed to be moderated through objective listening and adherence to ethical research practice and a constant sort of cycle of reflexivity to avoid bias. The conceptual framework that I used was required to sort of hold a mirror against the findings. I used Masmanian and Spatier, and it's useful because it's a framework that helps to sort of understand how you turn policy into practice, because it provides a comprehensive overview of the key implementation variables associated with a top-down, large-scale national change programme. So, you know, a rational policy process model assumes that a top-down process involves an idea being formulated and developed within a ministry, turned into a policy, refined in legislation through a process of ministerial guidance, and then we all do it. Yeah, sounds easy. But in public services, the reverse can play out, particularly with police officers acting with considerable discretion in their contact with citizens and en masse sort of defining the agency's overall behaviour. So to guard against this, we have to know what is required for diversion to work well. So Peter will go into the evidence base, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to cover some of the main points. So procedural justice, the perception of fairness. Perception of fairness to offenders as well as victims is really important for public confidence. Officers retain a high level of discretion, operating as street-level bureaucrats, and therefore any change needs to deliver more consistency in decision-making and have a cycle of ongoing training and tracking. In addition, if the point is to have conditions that are meaningful, to reduce reoffending, an assessment of needs to match conditions, and the range of provision needs to be accessible. We know that police-led diversion provides an opportunity for swift action after apprehension, and that celerity is an important component. So diversion requires that effective monitoring of completion of conditions and decision-making around compliance, with tracking and monitoring of performance. And this is often not given the consideration it deserves pre or post implementation. And then I've just put an area fertile for future research, the understanding of, okay, but with which groups does diversion have the greatest impact? And I've listed a few for consideration there. So, what do we know about what's required for successful implementation? There needs to be considerable training of officers. You know, be in no doubt that this is culture change. And as one of the participants said in their interviews, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. There needs to be consistency in eligibility screening to guard against counterproductive up-tariffing of offenders or higher risk offenders being diverted. There has to be thoughtful and consistent communication with victims. A recent survey concluded that actually people don't know what out-of-court resolutions are. There needs to be, an effort to kind of change the language around disposals. I mean, even the word disposal, that's why I use resolution. Because it's an opportunity to resolve crime effectively without the need to go to court. That's what officers should be saying to people, and communicating the positive outcomes around diversion. So a range of studies all indicated that it's important that officers not only understand the operational process, but the why around diversion and how effective it can be in reducing harm. Feedback should include stories, it should include data, not only with the front line, but with the public, to illustrate the effectiveness around reductions in reoffending. There should be a robust system of relevant conditions, tracking and compliance and monitoring performance. And finally, the role of senior leaders, all of you in the room, in providing strategic and symbolic leadership, and how that's translated to the boots on the ground should not be underestimated. But this is often given less consideration than the focus on structure, tasks and technology. So really quickly, the survey produced a wide range of qualitative and quantitative data, but it only provides a snapshot of the landscape at a particular point in time, and things have developed since then. But just very quickly, some forces were still delivering a whole range of disposals, while others had developed some sort of deferred prosecution. There was a wide range of delivery models, many of which hindered the ability to flex adequately to meet the impending changes. The gap was further illustrated by the range of different approaches, or none, to needs assessments. And there was a hodgepodge of different recording and management systems in the use of diversion. The landscape review indicated that progress was still required to make sure all forces could monitor compliance, and even more so required when it came to the ability to measure reoffending rates. So what were the findings of the research? Well, unsurprisingly, forces weren't ready. How could they be without a finalised code of practice, without the necessary RMS changes, and without even a system for administering fines, to name but a few? Force leads bemoaned the lack of process on these basic requirements and articulated that they were left dealing with the outcomes of a failure in the policy network to coordinate and prioritise activity. These challenges have been exacerbated by a convoluted and often opaque implementation process that left force leads struggling to galvanise the support of senior leaders. There was confusion with the creation of 2 new disposals, created seemingly in isolation, and questions about, well, what problem are they trying to solve? Force leads questioned the evidence base to support the transition to 2 new disposals with conditions, with significant concerns raised about whether the emergence of the new cautions created a more complicated and bureaucratic process, when simplicity had been one of the initial objectives of a reduced framework. There was a failure of hierarchical integration, with differing views on the role and willingness of specific institutions to meet the initial timelines for go-live. There appeared to be a lack of open dialogue at critical points with policing, at the point of formulating new policy, made worse by the subsequent churn of ministers at the MOJ, and a misfiring of how and when to engage powerful stakeholders, for example, the CPS. Force leads questioned how they were meant to implement and continue to fund more sophisticated responses to low-level offending without any additional resources. Some stated that they wished to transition to a centralised out-of-court resolution team, as they recognised that this was the best model to deliver and support the burden, take the burden off the front line, but could not do so without additional funding. There was a patchwork of different interventions available in force areas and little leverage for resources to be allocated in preparation for an unspecified period, leading one force lead to comment that they were not so much armed with a stick, but a twig when advocating for additional resources. There was widespread support for a code of practice, but concern that without innovations such as decision-making tools and scrutiny to track officers that they're doing what they're meant to do, the prevailing culture in some forces would remain. In the interviews across stakeholders, the different levels of support from sovereign agencies and understanding of diversion was often referred to, in particular the challenge faced by force leads when trying to advocate for those resources from senior leaders, particularly when the go-live date remained unspecified. One of the most concerning findings, and actually it really struck me, even though I'm in the role, was the level of this, was the toll that this was taking on the very people tasked to implement change. The force leads often verbalise feelings of not being listened to or devalued as subject matter experts within the field. They were critical of the ministry, but were universally positive around the support they'd received from the MPCC. The Ministry of Justice alluded to finding dealing with the police challenging and underestimated the complexities and scale of the change, with their primary focus being on legislation. There was a sense of government departments being overstretched and disconnected. The level of responsibility and stress exhibited within the focus group and survey responses at this particular moment in time should be a concern, as forces can ill afford to lose those with relevant knowledge and a corporate and national memory around the pre-implementation journey so far. It is also indicative of the need of senior leaders to give more support and prioritisation to the systemic development of good practice in the delivery of out-of-court resolutions, and the opportunity they present to deliver results against a range of interdependent strategies. After all, in some forces, out-of-court resolutions account for a third of positive outcomes. This is core policing. This is important stuff. It might not be sexy, but it gives you really good opportunities around early intervention. So, you know, if they're not dealt with correctly, we know that these are the crimes that cause dissatisfaction with the effectiveness of the police to deal with crimes that really impact on community well-being. However, there are reasons to be cheerful. The level of... yeah, I know, but there are. The level of commitment from force leads to make things work, because that's what we do in policing, was testament to how passionate the people are who work in this, and how successful diversion, though, is often driven by individuals rather than organisations. And that needs to change. They recognised that diversion sat across many policy outcomes, but wanted better coordination between the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. Policing often deals with short-term solutions rather than focusing on long-term change. And at the time of the research, many expressed doubt that the implementation, as it was then, on its current trajectory, would be successful across England and Wales. So to rectify this, there needed to be a reset, and I've listed some of the recommendations that I proposed. So firstly, don't set another go-live date. I think we've had 3 or 4, until you're secure in the knowledge that the basic requirements can and will be delivered. In the interim, the Ministry of Justice needs to show leadership and more understanding of the requirement for them to have direct and timely communication with forces. There should be influence brought to bear on senior leaders that diversion is an important part of core policing, so that they can harness the opportunities that well-run diversion can deliver. And nationally, continued exploration of technological tools and opportunities around commissioning, and a commitment from the centre to be unflinching in its messaging around the positive role diversion plays within the criminal justice system. Uncomfortable, they don't want to go there, but it's important that we actually do communicate that to people. And finally, a plea that came out of many of the interviews and focus groups for those who run deferred prosecution schemes, that this is recognised with its own national positive outcome code. Thank you.
And so the next person is Claire Ely.
Come up too early.
That's all right, Claire. You're ruining the only job I've got, but that's fine. Claire Ely, who is the head of criminal justice practice at the Centre for Justice Innovation. Thank you, Claire.
Thank
you. Sorry about that. So as Stevie said, I'm Claire. Nice to meet you all. So just a quick introduction about, because I'm not from police, and so give a bit of an introduction about my organisation and what we do. So the Centre for Justice Innovation is a UK-based charity. Our sort of vision is to put practitioners like you at the heart of practitioners and evidence at the heart of justice reform. And we support practitioners in youth, criminal and family justice systems to undertake research, and we do influencing with policymakers and officials. Our current areas of focus are diversion, both in youth and adult, out-of-court resolutions, both in youth and adult, court reform, community sentences. We also do stuff in the family courts around family drug and alcohol courts. But we're best known for our practice support with youth justice services and police forces, and we deliver youth diversion. And we've done it for sort of 10 years, and this is free, which I'm sure you'll all be pleased to hear. And we work very closely with the Youth Justice Board, the NPCC, MOJ, and the Youth Endowment Fund, who now fund us. So thank you very much. I'll go on to sort of what I'm going to cover today. So the topics I want to talk to you about are around what the evidence and research tells us about children and offending and the impact of the criminal justice system on children, and why diversion is a good solution to that, how we can deliver diversion well, and then also how my organisation can help. So I'm just going to sort of do a quick, and this might be some of the stuff that Peter might talk about as well, so I'll sort of get through it reasonably quickly. So, are you all familiar with the age crime curve? I'm sure quite a lot of you have seen it, but I think it's always useful to remind ourselves of the evidence base for this kind of stuff, because we get so caught up in the operation and the delivery, we forget why we do it the way that we do it, or that if we've gone slightly off on a tangent and have forgotten what the core sort of evidence is. So most children engage in risky or illegal behaviour at some point. I'm sure some of you may have as children. Most children are not apprehended following every poor decision, but for some, they're particularly unlucky, they're not very good at it, or they're more likely to get caught. And that risky behaviour can lead to contact with the police, but the vast majority of children will not go on to become escalating or prolific offenders, as the research tends to refer to them. The age crime curve shows that offending behaviour, while both detected and self-reported, peaks in the mid-teens, you can see there, then drops off steeply at the onset of young adulthood, and then it declines a bit more slowly. So the curve shows how incidence of crime decreases as children mature. So in other words, the vast majority of children will grow out of crime. And a first offence is not a particularly strong or reliable signal that a young person is about to embark on a persistent criminal career. Right, so next one. I'm having to do 2 laptops, sorry. So this is just a sort of a bit of a summary of some of the findings from the Edinburgh study of youth transitions in crime. It's one of the sort of best studies out there, like a longitudinal programme of research on pathways in and out of offending for a cohort of just over 4,000 children. They're continually putting stuff out, so I'd strongly recommend checking it out if you aren't aware of them. And some of the key stuff out of there that's relevant today is around which again will be very familiar to you, that pathways of criminal conviction for children to early adulthood vary considerably, depending on a person's early life circumstances. However, those who come persistently into contact with the justice system over time tend to be amongst the poorest and most vulnerable in our cohort. And people who have contact with the criminal justice system are not necessarily more likely to desist from offending, but for some, it may act as a catalyst for continued offending into adulthood. Okay. Are people familiar with that study? Have people sort of come across it? Yeah. So just from that study, and there's lots of others, formal justice processing for children involved in low-level and first-time offending can actually make them more likely to commit crime. It can extend and deepen their criminal careers, with outcomes worse the further a child progresses into the system. And the research base is clear on this front. An international meta-analysis, so a study of multiple outcome studies, shows that the prosecution of children appears not to have a crime control effect, and across all measures appears to increase offending. And like I said, this is not just 1 or 2 studies, this is sort of an international research consensus. So what does this sort of tell us? This is a really quick sort of tour of evidence. There's much more out there. But what it does tell us is that most children will grow out of crime. For those who don't, you can't tell them apart. It's really difficult. I think there's lots of people who'd love to be able to, but you can't tell which ones will grow out of it and which ones won't. We know the criminal justice system can do harm and could increase reoffending, but there is a better way, and that is diversion. It's a key part of the youth justice systems, their child first work that they do, and in policing, child-centred policing, it's a key part of that too. And it is an effective crime reduction strategy that keeps children safe, their families safe, communities safe, victims safe, and it's cheaper than prosecution. So, all right, we're doing more of it. Now, just quickly before I move on to the next slide, but I'm talking about diversion because there's lots of different types of diversion. The diversion I'm talking about here is around youth diversion, and the youth justice sort of definition for that is for children are sort of linked to an offence, and rather than them being given an out-of-court resolution, they're given more informal outcomes, and then they've got a support sort of package and intervention afterwards. So the more informal outcomes like a CER, a community resolution, or the outcome 22, outcome 21, that kind of thing. That's what I'm sort of talking about. So, what are some effective practice principles when delivering diversion? So I'm very lucky in this job. I get to go around and spend lots of time with police forces and youth justice services and find out what's working well and then combine it with the evidence base, and then I get to sort of share it with you all. So these are some learnings which I've sort of tailored today for police. I tend to do a mixed audience of youth justice practitioners and police, so I've just pulled out the police relevant ones for you all today, but there's lots of more if you're interested. That's in our toolkit, which you can find on our website. I'm also in the process of writing, as part of my work with VF, a specialist piece of guidance for police about delivery of diversion, so hopefully that will be out early next year, so keep an eye out for that. Right, so our effective practice principles are sort of 4 rules. So the first one is around your scheme and the work that you do. It must minimise labelling. So youth diversion schemes should take all reasonable steps to avoid stigmatising the children they work with, to prevent them from forming deviant or delinquent identities that may interfere with their development. So that labelling theory has been central to the rationale of youth diversion for decades. It's by reducing children's exposure to the formal justice system is sort of a key part of it, and youth diversion lessens that negative impact of labelling. So what does that mean for policing? So where you can use voluntary interviews, I know they're quite tricky sometimes, but where you can use them, use arrest and police custody sparingly. The impact on children can be incredibly traumatic. There's some fantastic research that's just come out by Vicky Kemp and Miranda Bevan that I highly recommend you have a read about police custody, particularly when we're looking with children with special educational needs and disabilities or neurodiversity. And there's some really great pilots happening with the PACE clock. Rather than 24 hours, it's 12 hours for kids, and it's showing some really interesting outcomes. And I think in one particular area, they've actually managed to get it down to 6 hours. So really great. So limiting that exposure to custody is very important. We interviewed a lot of children who've been through police custody, and it's just terribly frightening and has a really long-term impact on them. Also need to understand, as police officers, the impact of criminal records on children. So, and this is across, so youth justice service workers, solicitors, and police. The understanding of a criminal record and the impact is really different. It doesn't go off your record at 18. You know, it could still appear for the rest of your life. So you really need to think about the consequences if you are going to give an out-of-court resolution for a child, as that not just going to impact their ability in employment, but travel, insurance, you know, lots of things over the course of their lives. For some children, it's appropriate, the offence and the harm that's caused, it's appropriate that they have that criminal record, but, you know, not for all. So just to bear that in mind. Our next sort of core effective practice principle rule is it must avoid net widening, and Sarah alluded to that a bit here. So ensure the scheme operates as an alternative to the formal justice system rather than a supplement to it. Diversion should only be for children who would otherwise be dealt with formally in the justice system. So a crime has to have occurred, and a child has to have been linked to it. What we see sometimes is because it's a good route for children to access support that they wouldn't ordinarily get, there can be a bit of you know, pulling more children in than you need, and we know the impact of the criminal justice system, having children in there that shouldn't be there. So you need a sort of real clear distinction between your prevention work and your diversion work. The next one is, has it moved to? Yeah. Do not overdose children. So programming offered through diversion should be therapeutic and targeted, and for most diverted children, this would generally be light touch in and informal. And for police, this is particularly around timeliness and dosage. So diversion should happen as soon as possible after the arrest or the voluntary entry or whatever it might be. And speed of referral is particularly important. So our advice is within 2 weeks, you should be referring them, they should be referring and accessing support. Having a really long time since when it happened, the offence, and then to when the child is going to do work to address it, can limit its impact. So as quick as you can. But I know that's really difficult. It can take a long time to investigate, it can take a long time to get the process, but I think having some sort of remembering that you will be more effective in reducing harm and supporting that child the quicker you get them through is sort of really key. The work with the child should not last longer than a sort of statutory order or a statutory outcome. So you don't want a child doing diversion longer than they would do if you had given them a youth conditional caution. And it's also good to sort of understand that some children might not need any intervention at all. It could just be a one-time mistake. They've done something really stupid, they've sort of got the consequences of it, but they might have that support around them already. Don't just throw in support for support's sake or interventions for intervention's sake. It has to be targeted and appropriate for that child and the harm that they've caused. And I think this is my final effective practice principle. Yes, how am I doing for time? Am I all right? Am I talking too fast? Okay. The final one is around guarding against disparities. So access to and engagement with youth diversion schemes should be facilitated in a way that ensures all those suitable can avail themselves of its benefits. Diversion should help address disparities rather than exacerbate them. So this is the sort of tricky one, I think, but there's lots of areas that you can look at to help address this. So the first thing we always advise is to your police and youth justice services is know your local population and your demographics and what they look like in terms of national statistics, because everyone's disproportionality will be different depending on where you live. So figure out where those issues are, and it's likely if it's in your youth custody cohort, it's going to be pretty similar in your arrest and your youth justice service cohort, your probation cohort, you know, it all follows. And in our work, we found there's a sort of number of points in that diversion process where these disparities sort of occur. So the first one is around eligibility. Is this preventing your equal access? So when you're looking at stuff like offence type or number of previous convictions about someone going through, is there some stuff in there that you might be preventing? We worked with one area where the children who had possession of drug offences weren't allowed to then access the diversion programme. And it was in an area where the majority of children that were stopped and searched were black boys, and they were wondering why they were not getting many black boys on diversion. And so removing that meant that more children could access it. So you need to think about those little things that might be impacting people's access. Are you looking at, depending on obviously the outcome that a child's going to get, are you looking at full admission, no admission, acceptance of responsibility? You need to be really clear about what your thresholds are. Also, every police officer I've ever spoken to has a different view on what acceptance of responsibility is. It's really not clear. So please, if you are in charge of training or working with police, really get to the bottom of that and do some training and understanding with your officers, because it's different everywhere I've gone. And it really impacts someone's ability to get on or off of these schemes or get a particular outcome. And also give a bit of a thought to why a child might be not admitting guilt. Are they misunderstanding? Have they got special educational needs that they're not understanding what you're asking? They're scared. There's fear of reprisals. They're protecting their friends. It's advice they've been given by the parents. They've had some poor or not always the most appropriate legal advice, or they are innocent. So it's not always just a refusal to, engage in a process. So some sort of top tips, I guess, around this one. Train your staff on all sort of the outcomes that exist. again, with particularly outcome 22, because it is so confusing. If you can deliver training, that's great. We're going to do a bit of a training session on it in a few, well, probably November, I think we said, as a virtual learning cafe. So if you want to come along to that, feel free. But it is a very confusing outcome. There's no reason, it's understandable why there is inconsistent practice. But yeah, you need to, if you can, train your officers on it, on how it works and what's it intended to do. Have information in your police stations around for solicitors about the local offer, because often they are completely unaware of what's available for children. Not providing legal advice is just fact. This is the offer that is here, and then it's for that solicitor to decide what to do. Areas that we've seen where they do have co-location of the speech and language therapists to help police and youth justice services come with referrals and assessments tend to have more children managed through that process with those additional needs. But we appreciate that is quite expensive and, you know, isn't everywhere. It's a big resource, but it has seen some really positive practice where that exists. And disproportionality and how you're working with it should be a regular item on your joint decision-making panel and also your scrutiny panels, and your findings should be shared with everyone. And the last but not least is to monitor your rollbacks from court. So there's lots of children who are getting to court and then roll back for out-court resolutions or diversion. Something's going wrong there. So you need to monitor those and have a look and see what you can do to ensure that doesn't happen, because it's really expensive getting kids to court and it's quite traumatic as well. Like, I've sat in many, many courts and they're not great places to spend time if you don't need to. So that's everything from me as a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's some of my details up there. So you can get in touch with myself or any of my colleagues on our website if you are interested in any of the free support and training that we offer. We do it for both youth and adult. We've got similar toolkits and stuff around adult and the tier 2 madness. And there's a few people in the audience who have worked with us, so they can vouch for us, or not, hopefully vouch for us. So please just ask around. But yeah, thank you so much for letting me speak today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
I feel like the next speaker needs no introduction, but I'm still going to give him one, and that is Dr. Peter Neyroud, who's an associate professor here at the Institute for Criminology. Peter.
Actually, the new order fits moderately well, because I wanted to focus on adults, because implicitly both earlier speakers were focusing on a bit of both, but mostly youngsters in the last one. Why would this be a good moment to focus on adults in the system? Well, to be honest, the criminal justice system is not really going even as well as the Liz Truss budget just now. And it is a really difficult thing to say at the moment, because, you know, we're very, very proud of the criminal justice system in the UK. Those of us who have worked in it for all our lives, our working lives. But prisons are full, and that just feels like, well, the prisons are full. Well, the prisons are full, but this is creating a conundrum which is very, very, very difficult to get out of, because you've got a situation where the system is locked in decline, in lack of investment and reduced staff, etc. Charge rates have plummeted. Prisons are full. I mean, that seems like an odd kind of match, but because the last lot made no effort to try and solve this problem, they just passed the parcel with a bomb in it. An improvement in the charge rate is necessary. Well, yes, of course we need to improve the charge rate. It's dire, folks. But if we do that, the system will collapse. So how do you get out of that? Well, not just by carrying on pushing the forced meat into the mincer for it to come out the other end. That is not going to produce burgers. It'll produce something much nastier, and it won't be even as nice as an iceberg lettuce. And you know, in the meantime, we've heard lots of optimistic evidence here about, well, some not so optimistic from Sarah, about the state that the development of policy has got into in this territory, but a lot of optimistic evidence about the potential of diversion to help with this problem. After all, First thing to do is not to put so much, I'm sorry, I'm not going to use that, so not a very vegan metaphor, but not to put so much into the system. So, and one thing that we could have done was to have used out-of-court disposals. Okay, it's too complicated, it's a mess, it's evolved over time in the UK. I've not got the time to explain it, and even if I could, I doubt you'd want to listen to it, because it is a mess. But it's carrying on declining. Even beyond that graph, it's carrying on declining. Even with, the addition of out-of-court resolutions and all sorts of other things that have been tried, it's carried on declining. This is not good. And we've been here before. We've been here before when the last Labour government went down the road of, well, we'll reduce attrition in the system, we'll get more cases to resolution, and I tried to persuade them and successfully persuaded them to go down the route of a conditional caution. I have to say my career is littered with failure, and this is one of them. Okay, it failed because, although it was there for all the right reasons, what ended up happening was that instead of it embracing a whole range of offences, and in particular a whole range of offences for adults, what happened was that almost all the results were minor criminal damage, and almost all of the resolutions, and there weren't that many of them, by the way, were apologies and letters, which, when we came to have a look at them, were mostly written by officers. I mean, it's some of the most stilted language you've ever seen for an apology letter. And tiny numbers. It made no difference. Why did it fail? Well, there's a bit of the system in the middle of the system, the Crown Prosecution Service, whose response to a problem is to create another form for the police to fill to prevent you putting the file in. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but it is exactly what's going on at the moment. You're getting more forms to ask you for more information to send the file in, and that is a means of rationing. Let's not beat around the bush. I don't usually, by the way. And then we've got this unlooked for, unwanted child in the thought that Sarah has so neatly laid out. This has slightly less evidence than Donald Trump's allegation about pet-eating immigrants, because we've not tested this at all. It has not been tested. We are about to put something out on the ground that is untested after having done 10 years of tested work. Sorry, I don't usually hold back. And yet we know what works. We know what works for youngsters. So I'm just putting up the two systematic reviews. I'm the co-chair, or have been the co-chair of the Campbell collaboration. We've put the peg in the ground. The first one is, as was said in the previous session, previous piece, putting young people through the criminal justice system is a very expensive way of making them worse in most cases. So don't do it unless you absolutely have to. And on the other hand, police-led diversion does work, so why wouldn't you use it? Please read the systematic reviews. They're very, very good systematic reviews. These slides will be available. And I got the task of having a look at what was supposed to happen after, any review that is kicked off by Chris Grayling. At least it didn't involve trying to find boats, for those that remember that story. But, I mean, any review that's kicked off by Grayling is not likely to end well, and this one didn't. But at least we were going down the route of a system that seemed to have the support of the service, a two-tier model, and we did identify things that worked. So let me just whisk through those. So we know speed matters, and indeed the Prime Minister noted that with the riots. Speed matters. That connection between you riot, you go to prison, is a really important message of deterrence. And it's the same for cautioning. Don't spend hours trying to make the decision slightly better and lose the connection between the offence and the event. So speed matters. Cautioning may be discriminatory, and one of the major reasons for that is you're asking people to admit guilt to caution, and there's a whole series of groups in our community that have a lower level of trust in the police and are less likely to feel able to admit guilt in those circumstances. And that is a major driver, as David Lammy showed, of the discrimination right at the start of the system. And that is the sort of thing that makes the system procedurally unfair and therefore ineffective and causing harm. They've not been applied consistently. I think Sarah laid that out brilliantly. And actually, if we carried on going down the route without listening to Sarah's research, which I hope will now be the case, we could just be making this a whole lot worse. We know diversion for drug offenders works. We've known it for a long time, and the evidence has been accruing, and I'll point up it's getting better. And we know, because this is a report from the Tony Blair Institute that was looking across the whole system, that unless we are bold in segmenting, i.e. targeting, the groups that are coming through into this criminal justice system, we are not going to get out of this bind. So we have to use evidence in an assertive way in order to make a difference with this. And one of those assertive ways, you're going to hear a bit of this later on, but Jacob Verry is one of our PhDs, Barak, Larry Sherman and I have been, particularly with some data out of the huge amount of data out of the PNC, have been continuing to work over quite a period of time on how big is that low-risk group that we really can take risks with, as in we can be bold. Well, it's huge. It's 62% of our offenders. Why are we prosecuting these people without actually at least trying the possibility of diversion? And you're not supposed to read all the stuff on the right-hand side. It's not a reading test. But read the Wilson and Lipsey for those that are interested. I think it's open access. David Wilson and Mark Lipsey are two of the global experts on treatments and on assessing treatments. And there's a great, we're not short of treatments that work. So why wouldn't you use them? And not all of these are expensive. They're a lot cheaper than taking someone through the court system and then giving them a fine, them not paying it, you going out to try and serve it, somebody then having to do a warrant. With all of that stuff that we're doing at the moment, it's like hamsters with a death wish. So, alternatives, as I say, never knowingly undertold. We've got Turning Point. We've had Turning Point in Birmingham for quite some time, and then we've got Checkpoint from Durham. John Cooper is here in the audience, all but Dr. John Cooper, because I've just passed his PhD thesis. That is an appropriate moment to clap, by the way. And we've got Turning Point London. So I'm just to repeat, this is about deferred prosecution rather than cautioning, takes the plea of guilty out of the equation and puts us in a position to do the same sorts of things, and we've got increasing body of evidence for this particular model. So why wouldn't we use it? Voluntary participation, I think the point was made about alerting solicitors to the possibility is great because you want them to be driving it with their clients and explaining it. It's an agreed plan. It's about being clear about non-compliance. It's being about clear about the type of conditions. And we saw in the original Birmingham trial significant reductions of crime harm, of getting people through the system. Some of the timescales in the court system, even at that stage, which was back in 2012, 2013, 2014, would make you weep. But now, of course, it's beyond weeping. Victim satisfaction increased and reduced cost. Why wouldn't you do this? Well, you might not do it in the sense because it's not that straightforward to deliver, as in you have to do this job properly. So you have to pay attention to how you tell people what it is that you're trying to do. Most people do not understand out-of-court resolutions. For a start, we've had a semantic debate for the last 18 months about what you call these things, because you can't call them cautions because that sounds like just a warning to let them off. You can't call them out-of-court disposals because who the hell understands that? You can't call... So we come down to out-of-court resolutions. Really? Okay. Diversion equally has all sorts of... So it is difficult to explain in simple terms to the victim in the street, as it were, who's getting this. So the right way to explain that what we're trying to do is, simple terms, is to prevent the reoffending occurring again and to give a decent opportunity for that to happen through conditions that work through with the offender. And by the way, to the victim, you have an opportunity to say some of the things that you might think would be particularly helpful for you. And so, i.e., I don't want to see this person, I want him to keep a distance, which could be a very obvious one. And if you do that, that honesty and integrity of purpose, that procedurally just approach, can secure a much higher level of confidence. And at the moment, it's not as if the criminal justice system is enjoying romping confidence with the public. That's an understatement, in case anyone had failed to notice that one. It's a problem. It is a problem because legitimacy in this system matters a lot. People engage and take part in this system because they feel confident that it will actually do something. If they don't, they won't. And then in Turning Point for adults, perhaps the most, we did a thing called block randomisation where we split the group down in the randomisation process into adults with personal victims, adults without, juveniles with and without. And you can see there's quite a significant difference between crimes which are violent crimes where the effect size is strong and in the direction of the turning point, and it's about level pegging when you start talking about crimes without a personal victim, drugs, for example. It's not quite so strong, but it's still. This is the one of what are you comparing it with? Well, we're comparing it with going to court. So you've got it's going to have to be, if it's a level pegging, we're doing pretty well. The challenging one is crime is young people with crimes with no personal victim, because actually we know those are exactly the same, the youngsters, where there is probably an accelerator that's going to push them a bit faster after the process. But you still try. And then we've got, well, it's not just does it work. In this crisis of criminal justice, we need to know whether it works and whether the money stacks up. And John's, I have to say, he's got to upload his PhD fairly soon because he'd be asked to do that so that he can go and collect his degree. As he uploads it, you will all have access to it, and I strongly recommend that you read it. You don't get many recommends like that, John, to read a PhD, I have to say. But I would recommend you read it if you're at all interested in diversion, because what he does is he takes a trial which wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And then he does the most spectacular cost-benefit analysis, the best one I've seen, to be honest, in terms of the care that he's taken going through it. Checkpoint was better than a score draw, but even if you make it a score draw, it's £1 to nearly £3 in cost-benefit. Is that fair, John? Yeah. And if we then look at Operation Cara, which was taking adults with low-harm domestic violence cases, and we take that one, and then we take their replication, both Cara and the replication come out, well, actually, at about 1 to nearly 3. So why wouldn't you do that? And then we've got the Australian government, who are also investing in this, commissioned an up-to-date systematic review. It's only published in the last 12 months on drug diversion. I told you the evidence was getting better, and it is getting better. It's clearly in the direction that police-led diversion of drug offenders, adult drug offenders, is a positive thing to do. And I would commend this particular review, because what they talk about is the kind of flexibility that the police can have at the beginning of the system is much better adapted to trying to find solutions for offenders. And a lot of the people we're dealing with, there's people who are involved in Project Adder here, and that has been not at all hard work, we're fair to say, Ben. But nevertheless, a real attempt to try and tackle chronic drug abusers with a process of deferred cautioning. But, to conclude, you've got to do this job properly. It does work. It probably works. It certainly works for youngsters. It certainly works for young adults. It pretty much works for adults. You've got to be careful about which offences and all of those debates need to be had properly and with thought. It works with low-harm, low-risk offenders, but the Checkpoint programme demonstrated that it can work with medium-risk offenders as well, without putting the public at risk. And compare that, by the way, with having to tip people out early from the prison system without their treatment or their sentence being processed, which is absolutely the worst place to be, but a necessary process, because otherwise there's nowhere to put the people the cops arrest. I mean, really? And the day what we have in the UK, where the government has to take out an advert to explain that to the public, is a moment of shame, not gain. Last but not least, all of the things that Sarah said, all of the things my colleague from the Centre for Justice and Innovation has said about doing this job properly, screening properly, needs assessments matched to the offenders, setting and tracking offences, doing this thing professionally is what will deliver a system that will improve that bottom end of the system faster than we will do by trying to pedal furiously to put more people through the court system. And on that note, thank you.
you, Peter. That means we have a whopping 7 minutes for questions. I'm going to take all the credit, though I think I had nothing to do it and it was all down to Annabelle, but I'm going to take the credit. Do we have any questions for our speakers? Straight up there at the back. I don't know if we have a mic today, so you might just need to shout.
Oh, it's all right. I've got a voice. I can talk on
Okay.
I'm Anna Baker and I lead Diversion for North Wales Police, and we have our own checkpoint camera version. So I'd like to thank the panel for flying the flag really and highlighting the difficulties and challenges that we've had. Just a question, and it's not a loaded question before I start. And to all the operating models in terms of deferred prosecution in the UK at the moment, two things for me. Are there any that you perceived to be really effective and pioneering that maybe stand out, without giving anyone too much credit, I suppose, because we're all trying to do the same thing. And why do you think that certain areas of diversion are chronically underfunded when you can see the benefits?
Thank you.
So I'll take the first bit, if I may, and then pass over to the others. I think it's really important that, and I talked about this impromptu at the last conference, that we recognise the importance of relationships and people working with people. And actually sometimes that's lost, you know, and it's lost more in policing maybe than in other sort of human services, healthcare, for example. And I think we have to get better at recognising that deferred prosecution is an opportunity to actually ask not what's wrong with you. It's often people who have multiple needs but aren't reaching thresholds, who are going to keep coming and escalating into the system, some of them, but to actually ask what's happened to you and to have a meaningful conversation, because most of those low-level offenders, they're not sophisticated offenders. They don't want to be in the cycle or have some of the issues that are going on. So it's about recognising that there are needs that all feed into the criminogenic behaviour. And most people, when you have a conversation with them, want to change. And I think the deferred prosecutions, where there is a really strong relationship model between key worker or navigator, or I don't know what you call them, Anna, sorry, in your model, it I think is really important. People change because of people.
Thank you.
So I think it's relatively new. Stevie, you might know a bit more, but the one in Merseyside, that the Youth Justice Service, what's it called?
Op inclusion.
Op inclusion. And I don't think it's been running hugely long.
No, I think it might be a couple of years, so it's a really
Yeah.
close relationship between the police and the youth justice services.
And it's for no comment interviews, so we're having a lot of those and working with children so they still sort of access that support. And that seems to be going pretty well. I mean, it's not evaluated, it's new, but in terms of if you look at, they're working in line with the evidence base and the outcomes seem to be pretty good. I would definitely get in touch with them and learn a bit more about what they're up to, because it looks really great. And just to say as well, we've started to do a bit of practice support work with North Wales, so you might be seeing a bit more of me and my colleagues with the Youth Justice Services.
Thank you. Peter?
So we do know quite a lot about what is likely to be good.
Yeah.
So there have been 3 or 4 studies. I've contributed to two for the Youth Endowment Foundation. One where we 3 of us combed through just about everything that's been written about youth justice, and some of it was not great, but we coded it for quality of evidence, and that one's now published and out there.
Yeah.
Ciara Keenan's work in particular. That's worth going through just to check. Is it, how close is your scheme to that? Is there anything you're not doing because that's the summary of the better evidence out there. The second one that I think is also worth looking at was the RAND study that, again, I was an advisor to, where they were looking at liaison on diversion or diversion for those with a mental health or special needs, etc. And one of the things that Lucy and the team tried to do was to work through what did a better. I mean, I don't like best practice, because I don't really think there's any such thing. What there are better practices that are better adapted to your particular area, and they came out with a model that does depend on the force and the nature of the structure. Because you know, you aren't going to have the complexity of services in North Wales, or out in the bottom end of Devon and Cornwall. But so you have to have a slightly different model, don't you? Yeah. There's a kind of urban model and there's a not so urban model. So then there's the question of the relative costs of centralising things. Now, obviously, with online, we can do a bit better. I think there are some. We can be a bit more flexible. The more that you've got some sort of central capability that is acting as both in terms of practice development, but also controlling and tracking, the more that you're likely to get consistency, as certainly the RAND work says. But then the other big piece that goes with that, and I'm looking across at Amanda, who's somewhere over on my left-hand side, I think, from Dorset, is that there's a big piece about the chief communicating the importance of this work. There's a really big piece about giving staff permission to make this important. Yeah, sorry, I can see you. But I think that is, Amanda, I'm looking at you, I think that is really, really critical. If staff know that this is something that is owned, and they're getting the support, that goes a long way towards giving people permission to take it more widely, because you need fundamentally the support of your whole frontline staff. Custody officers, are particularly critical to make sure that cases are decided and eligibility is done properly at the very early stage, and if there's needed. So it's all of those little pieces. But I do recommend the RAND study it's a bit of a big read, but it does have some very good sections on what good is. And I think just checklisting down there, is there something here that we're not doing, or we've decided to do it differently? It doesn't make what you've decided to do wrong, but I think you'll get an idea of the kind of choices that you need to make in order to get to the better practice and to continue to develop.
And can I come in, just, I know we've only got like 30 seconds, but on your point around why is this not funded? So one of the things that came out really strongly from the research talking to forces was, people aren't brave enough, and that's coming from the centre. Diversion, well, it might be sort of interpreted as a soft touch. Yeah. Now, I know, and I can only talk about I know how robust our scheme is. And the reality is there needs to be bravery. There needs to be bravery from chief constables, there needs to be bravery from the centre, there needs to be really strong messaging and support, as we've seen from MPCC. And being able to articulate, because it depends, and the RAND study showed this, and Crest Advisory and others, if you ask people different questions, you get different answers. And actually, most people are supportive, but we're not brave enough, and we're not training our officers to have those really skilled conversations about what it actually is.
Thank you so much. I'm a stickler for punctuality, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We haven't got time for any more questions, but can we please put our hands together again for our three speakers? Thank you.
Thanks, Stevie, and thanks everyone. So, an absolutely fascinating insight there into the CJS, let's face it, and the world of out-of-court resolutions. And this is the insight we all have now. We have the evidence to understand what works, and it is down to all of us in this room and others to take the evidence away and make positive change happen. So thank you, a really fantastic session.